Hi, and thanks for coming back again. This is the third lecture in my course on international law and organization. I'm John Wagner Givens. And in the last lecture, we talked about how, because there is no international government, the institutions of international law aren't as clear-cut as they might be in a domestic system. So in a domestic system, we'd have a legislature to make law, but in international law, we have different sources of international law: treaties, custom, general principles of law, judicial decisions, and legal scholarship. Now we're going to be talking about the other institutions of international law. So these are institutions of enforcement. So in domestic law, we have the police, for example. In international law, we have something rather different. In international law, because all states are theoretically equal, we have states have to sort of enforce violations or of international law themselves. So one of the most common ones, and I've already talked about this in the last lecture, is reciprocity. Most of the time, the reason that states obey international law is they want other states to obey international law. So if I sign an extradition treaty and a criminal from your country has escaped to my country, I give them back to you because I want you to do the same. Right? That's reciprocity. It's the same with a lot of international trade, right? The reason that I don't raise tariffs on you is I don't want you to raise tariffs on me. So even though that might not seem like a strong way of enforcing law, it actually tends to work pretty well. Shaming is another one. Again, this is one that international relations realists might kind of chuckle at, but there can be real costs of not following international treaties, right? So if you're a signatory to a treaty on international labor rights that say we don't allow for children under the age of 12 to work in factories, and then people find out that actually children under the age of 12 are working in factories in your country, you might see a drop in investment. Nike might pull out, right, for example. Nike might stop having its products made in your country. So naming and shaming can also be a function of international law, pointing out your failure to agree with international law, your moral failings, your problems. Now, cycling up from that, right, if somebody has violated international law in perhaps a more serious way or calls for a more serious response, you can do something called retortion. This is just a technical term. That means it's something that you can do against another country, one country can do against another, that's legal, but is kind of nasty, it's unpleasant, it's negative. So if there's a river that flows from Canada down into the United States, and Canada, we have a treaty about exactly how much Canada is allowed to pollute in it, but Canada's violating that treaty. They're just pouring tons of junk into the river, and it comes down into the United States, and we want to give them a strong message that we don't like that, we can practice an act of retortion. So we could, for example, withdraw our diplomatic presence there. We could call back our ambassadors, right? This is something that we don't do to Canada. We have done with other countries in the past. We could call back our ambassadors. And this might have not only this kind of shaming effect, but it could be a major inconvenience and even an economic that could even do some economic damage to the country, right? So their citizens would be difficult for them to continue to trade and to travel to our country. So retortion can have real costs. Again, especially retortion like this, where you're withdrawing your diplomatic presence to that country. And then ramping it up still further from retortion. Again, retortion are acts that are technically legal, but are unpleasant or nasty. Countermeasures are acts that are illegal without, except that they're being used to respond to a already illegal action. Perhaps the best example of this is the first Iraq War, the first Gulf War, in which Iraq was not entirely unprovoked by Kuwait, right? Kuwait was drilling into Iraqi oil fields. They were doing horizontal drilling, right? So instead of drilling directly down, they were drilling at an angle to get under the border to get at Iraqi oil fields. Iraq invaded Kuwait. This is a violation of international law because even though what Kuwait was doing in this horizontal drilling may not have been entirely legal, Iraq's response was wildly disproportionate. And this is an important aspect of international law we'll see, especially when we deal with war law, right? The idea that You have to respond proportionally when someone attacks you. So if someone attacks you with 100 troops, you can't respond with a flurry of nuclear missiles, right? Okay, so Iraq had this wildly disproportionate response to Kuwait's behavior. They invaded the whole country when Kuwait was doing some horizontal drilling. And so basically the entire world, most countries in the world got together under the auspices of the UN. There was a UN resolution saying Iraq's action is illegal, and a coalition of militaries from around the world came to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. Right? So these are countermeasures. It's not normally legal to attack the country of Iraq unless they have done something illegal beforehand to warrant it. Right? So these are countermeasures. So those are the methods of enforcement in international law. At least those are some of them. So reciprocity, naming and shaming, retortion, and countermeasures. Okay. A judiciary. So again, this is the third institution we need to really have law. We need, so we have sources of law like treaties. We have enforcement mechanisms of this law like reciprocity, countermeasures. And now we need a judiciary. And this is where we have institutions that look a lot more like the judiciaries we have elsewhere, right? So not all aspects of international law are covered by something that actually is a court, but a lot of them are. So disputes between countries of various kinds, say about where a border lies, can be determined. These decisions can be made by the International Court of Justice. This sits in The Hague and has been around a long time. I'm going to ask you to watch a video on it this week. I hope you enjoy it. And this actually is the successor to an international court that was created before World War II. So it's quite a long ongoing institution, and it's been rather successful. There's also an International Criminal Court, right? The International Criminal Court, again, as you might suspect, prosecutes crimes, but especially crimes by, for example, heads of state. So crimes against humanity, crimes committed in wartime. The WTO also has an appellate body, right? So the WTO has a court. This helps us make decisions, right? If the United States says that China is dumping tires, that means they're selling tires at an artificially low cost to hurt American manufacturers of tires. The WTO can make a ruling on whether this is true or not. And if the WTO decides, yes, in fact, China is dumping tires or selling them at an artificially low cost, then they'll give the United States permission to respond with their own, for example, tariffs or taxes on Chinese imports. So that sometimes that'll escalate into what we call a trade war. But again, we have a judicial body of a kind, the appellate body of the World Trade Organization, that will make that determination for those entities. Now, so again, those are just some of the examples of judicial bodies that make that interpret and make decisions about international law. So the final thing I want to note is on power in international law. Another reason people often say there is no such thing as international law is because powerful actors are able to ignore international law, right? European countries, when dealing with each other, generally follow international law or the law of the EU, which is another kind of regional international law. But when it gets to a country like the United States, again, that first Gulf War, that first invasion of Iraq was pretty clearly legal. But the second invasion of Iraq, and especially the overthrowing of the government of Iraq, was less clearly legal. And yet the United States did it anyway. And it really didn't suffer that many major consequences. There was a little bit of shaming, right? There are other countries and international organizations that said that's illegal. But George W. Bush isn't really under threat of going to jail for his actions, even though, again, probably under some interpretations of international law, they were illegal. And so people suggest, again, especially international relations realists suggest there's no such thing as international law. But this is actually similar to domestic law too, right? The more powerful somebody is, the less we expect them to actually suffer the consequences for their actions, right? A billionaire with teams of lawyers is much less likely to get convicted of a crime than an average petty criminal. A large corporation, when you have a contract dispute with a small company, right, is much more likely to win, even if they're not right. Again, so although this is true in international law, although to a certain extent might makes right, and the powerful countries are not held accountable in the same way that less powerful countries are, although that's certainly true, and we can also see this with the International Criminal Court. In the International Criminal Court, it's primarily been leaders of sub-Saharan African countries that have been prosecuted. So again, George W. Bush has relatively little fear of getting prosecuted by the International Criminal Court, but several leaders of African countries have. Probably largely because those countries are less powerful than the United States. But again, it's something we see in domestic law, perhaps not just as much, but still very readily. So again, international law actually looks a lot like domestic law, although there are some major differences. All right, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.